August 25th, 1944. Northern France. The sun was barely a pale ember behind drifting clouds. Mud-swallowed boots and diesel fumes hung thick in the morning air. From the shattered ruins of Saint-Lô to the open fields near Chartres, a low thunder began to build, steady, mechanical, relentless. Then they appeared, hundreds of olive-drab GMC trucks, each roaring past with headlights masked and engines howling. Tires crushed the broken stones of French roads once occupied by the Wehrmacht. Canvas flaps snapped in the wind, each truck marked with a small red circle on white. A single command: Red Ball Express. Inside, young American drivers, most barely 20, many African American, gripped the wheels through exhaustion and fear. Behind them stretched a column that would not end, moving ammunition, food, and fuel to keep the Allied armies alive. They drove day and night, sleeping in shifts, racing time and death to feed a war that refused to stop. This was no ordinary supply route. It was the heartbeat of the liberation, and the Germans were about to find out what happens when America turns logistics into a weapon. June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. When Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, they carried with them the hope of a continent. In a single day, over 156,000 men crossed from England to France, pushing through sand, shrapnel, and steel to open the gateway to Europe. The invasion was a success. But beneath the triumph lay a silent, growing problem. One that had nothing to do with German guns. It was fuel. By July, Allied divisions had broken through the hedgerows of Normandy and were racing across France. General George S. Patton's Third Army moved faster than any supply chain in history had ever been asked to follow. Tanks rolled forward, burning through 800,000 gallons of fuel a day. Every bullet, every ration, every tire had to come from the beaches. Because no major port was yet in Allied hands. Cherbourg was captured but left in ruins. Le Havre and Brest were still under German control. The beaches at Omaha and Utah, once landing zones, were now clogged with supply dumps. Piles of ammunition sat exposed under rain. Fuel drums were stacked like walls, waiting for trucks that never arrived. France's shattered railways were no help. Bridges were gone, locomotives destroyed by Allied bombers before D-Day. The very success of the invasion had outpaced the infrastructure meant to sustain it. The supply nightmare. By August 1944, the front lines were more than 300 miles from Normandy. What began as a trickle of supply trucks became a desperate flood. Convoys stretched for miles, drivers sleeping at the wheel. For every gallon of gasoline delivered, another was burned hauling it there. The Army called it the logistical tail. But the truth was simpler. The Allies were running out of fuel faster than they could move it. Patton's tanks began to stall in open fields, not from German fire but from empty tanks. Eisenhower's supreme headquarters at Chaillef grew anxious. If the advance stopped, the Germans could regroup, reinforce, and dig in. The war might drag on for another year. In the middle of this chaos stood the Quartermaster Corps, the unsung engineers of war. Their maps showed crumbling bridges, cratered highways, and desperate requests from every front. A decision had to be made. Either slow the advance, or find a way to move mountains of supplies across a country in ruins. Eisenhower refused to stop. The birth of a name-out. Of that urgency came a plan. One that would stretch the imagination of logistics to its breaking point. The idea was simple, brutal, and brilliant. Create a continuous loop of trucks running supplies from Normandy to the front line, 24 hours a day. No stops, no delays. A one-way system of movement so fast and so disciplined that it would operate like an artery feeding the Allied war machine. They called it the Red Ball Express, borrowing its name from American rail slang. Red ball trains that had the right-of-way on every track. In this new version, the highway itself became a living track, and every truck was a locomotive of war. On August 25, 1944, the first convoy rolled out under the command of Lieutenant-Colonel Laurent A. Ayers. Hundreds of trucks began their run eastward, loaded with fuel, ammunition, rations, and spare parts. Their route, from Saint-Lô to Chartres, then on toward Paris and beyond. Their mission, to keep the momentum alive, at all costs. But this was more than logistics. It was a gamble. The men behind the wheels were about to drive through an unforgiving landscape, often under fire, with minimal sleep, little recognition, and a weight that no soldier could see. The weight of an entire army's survival. And as the Red Ball Express began to roll, something else was revealed. The human story hidden beneath the roaring engines. A story of courage, exhaustion, and defiance. Late August 1944, Normandy, France. When the Red Ball Express officially began on August 25, 1944, few believed it could last more than a week. The plan was audacious. 700 miles of round-trip road convoys moving across war-torn France, 24 hours a day, through unpredictable weather, and an enemy that refused to die quietly. But desperation breeds ingenuity. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps and quartermaster units transformed the French countryside into a machine of motion. They carved out a network of roads, one route for trucks heading to the front, another for the return. No civilian vehicles were allowed. Signs painted with red circles marked the way. Red Ball Route, military vehicles only. Within days, it became the largest truck convoy operation in military history. A miracle of organization at its peak. The Red Ball Express employed over 6,000 vehicles and 23,000 drivers, supported by thousands of mechanics, dispatchers, and security teams. The trucks were mostly 1 or 2-ton GMC Jimmy cargo haulers, reliable, rugged, and loud. Each could carry 5,000 pounds of cargo. Some hauled fuel drums stacked to the roof, others ammunition, rations, or spare tank treads. A few even carried blood plasma and medical supplies for field hospitals closer to the front. The convoy system was ruthless in its efficiency. Drivers were ordered to maintain a minimum speed of 25 miles per hour, no matter the conditions. Overtaking was forbidden. Stopping was punishable unless for emergency. Headlights were dimmed or painted blue for night runs. Mechanics established repair stations every few miles. Military police directed intersections around the clock. The roads themselves were dangerous. Bridges were barely patched, craters filled with gravel. Rain turned dirt tracks into rivers of mud, while the dust of summer blinded convoys during daylight. Many drivers joked that Red Ball didn't refer to the painted insignia, but to the bloodshot eyes of men who hadn't slept in days. The human engine. What made the Red Ball Express truly extraordinary wasn't the trucks or the roads. It was the men. Nearly 75% of the drivers were African-American soldiers, members of segregated transportation units. At a time when the U.S. Army still divided men by color, these drivers were given a mission that would decide the fate of the war in Western Europe. Most were drafted from labor battalions, men used to digging trenches and building camps. Few had been trained for long-distance driving under combat conditions. But when the call came, they stepped forward. They learned fast, navigating under blackout conditions, dodging strafing attacks from the Luftwaffe, and repairing engines in the dark with nothing but flashlights and grit. Some convoys drove 400 miles in a single run, resting only when fuel or exhaustion forced them off the road. Meals were ration cans eaten behind the wheel. Cigarettes became currency. And music, the blues, jazz, gospel, echoed from truck radios whenever static allowed it. In that endless rhythm of engines and gears, they found identity, pride, and purpose, leadership and vision. Behind the chaos stood leadership. General Dwight D. Eisenhower understood that logistics, not strategy, would win this war. He gave the Red Ball Express absolute priority over all other traffic. "Without supplies, our armies will fail," he wrote in August 1944. "Without fuel, our tanks will stop." Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, commander of the communication zone, coordinated the operation with ruthless precision. And under him, officers like Major General Cecil R. Moore and Colonel Loren Ayres kept the system alive, improvising constantly, rerouting convoys around wrecked bridges, seizing French trucks when spares ran out, and requisitioning every gallon of fuel they could find. But even the best plans came at a price. Truck engines overheated, tires blew out, accidents were constant. Some drivers fell asleep and veered off cliffs. Others were ambushed by retreating German units or harassed by snipers hiding in the woods. The Red Ball Express was fast, but it was never safe. A nation in motion by early September 1944, the convoys were moving 12,000 tons of supplies every day. Fuel for Patton's tanks, ammunition for Bradley's infantry, food for Montgomery's men driving toward Belgium. The Allied advance, once teetering on collapse, surged again. The French people watched in awe as columns of American trucks roared through their villages, their red circle insignia gleaming through the dust. Children waved. Soldiers shouted greetings. To them, the Red Ball Express wasn't just a convoy. It was the sound of liberation. But inside those trucks, the drivers knew another truth. Their mission was never glorious. They had no medals, no parades, no time to rest. Yet every mile they drove kept men alive at the front. Every gallon of fuel delivered meant another tank could roll. Another town could be freed. And as September deepened into autumn, the Red Ball Express became more than a supply route. It became a symbol of endurance, unity, and the hidden strength behind victory. Because war isn't won only by bullets. Sometimes it's won by wheels, the roar of 6,000 trucks, the rhythm of survival. Behind every convoy was a heartbeat, a driver gripping the wheel, fighting fatigue, hunger, and fear. These were not men of glory, not pilots or tank commanders. They were truckers, soldiers in grease-stained fatigues who carried the war on their shoulders. The human angle, brotherhood in motion. Many of them were young African-American men from places like Georgia, Mississippi, and Illinois. They had never seen France before. They'd barely been respected by their own country. Yet, when the call came, they became the arteries of the Allied advance. Most served in segregated units, the 36th 40th, 39 47th, 39 18th Quartermaster Truck Companies. Names few would remember, but whose work kept the front alive. Their commanders often doubted them. Some officers even believed black soldiers could not handle complex machinery. The Red Ball Express shattered that prejudice. They drove through nights without headlights, relying on the faint glow of the truck ahead. They followed white ribbons tied to tailgates when fog swallowed the road. When bridges collapsed, they built makeshift crossings with planks and willpower. When convoys broke down, they cannibalized parts from wrecked vehicles to keep moving. Private Luther D. Page of the 39 18th later recalled, "We were told, 'You stop, they die.' So we didn't stop." Fatigue was the true enemy. Men averaged only 4 hours of sleep in 48. Some fell asleep at the wheel and woke up in ditches. Yet few complained. The rhythm of the convoy, the thundering engines, the shifting gears, became a strange comfort. It was movement that meant purpose. Every mile was a victory, and through it all, camaraderie formed. Drivers shared cigarettes, swapped jokes in broken French, and sang to stay awake. On the Red Ball Express, segregation blurred at the edges, because survival did not discriminate. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a supply mission. It was a tactical masterpiece, a military ballet performed on shattered roads. The Allied command created a system of control points, checkpoints every 25 miles manned by MPs with stopwatches and clipboards. If a convoy fell behind schedule, the delay was logged and the route recalculated. Speed was life. Timing was doctrine. Each convoy was assigned a number, with a lead jeep guiding the column and radio contact maintained through command posts. Breakdowns were expected, so repair crews were stationed every 10 miles, armed with spare tires, tools, and fuel drums. If a truck couldn't be fixed in 10 minutes, it was pushed off the road and stripped for parts. The mission never waited for anyone. The route itself was both lifeline and battlefield. German stragglers and snipers haunted the forests. Mines still lined the shoulders of the highway. Luftwaffe fighters occasionally dove from the clouds to strafe the convoys, forcing drivers to scatter into ditches or under their trucks for cover. But even the enemy couldn't stop the movement. Each night, the roads shimmered with the faint glint of metal and dust. Thousands of trucks rolling eastward, everyone carrying the fate of a soldier at the front. To the Germans, it must have looked like an endless iron river. The discipline was brutal. Drivers were told, "You have the road, but not the right to stop." They carried no weapons besides their pistols. Their defense was speed and numbers. The Red Ball Express was designed to overwhelm, to deliver by sheer momentum. It was logistics turned into a weapon. The backbone of the operation was the GMC CCKW-2 1-2-ton truck, affectionately called the Deuce and a Half. It was simple, tough, and utterly dependable. Powered by a 270 cubic-inch straight-six engine, it could carry 5,000 pounds of cargo over terrain that would kill most vehicles. With four-wheel drive and rugged suspension, it became the chariot of victory. Each truck was stripped of unnecessary weight, sideboards removed, windshields folded down. Some were converted into fuel carriers with 700-gallon tanks. Others carried food, ammunition, or replacement parts for Shermans and Jeeps. The trucks were painted with white stars and a red circle insignia that glowed faintly under dust and moonlight. Was fragility. Every truck, every driver, every gallon mattered. If the chain broke, the war would stall, and just as the trucks pushed east, toward Paris and the Siegfried Line, the strain began to show. In the men, the machines, and the miles, because even a miracle has limits. The leadership angle, Eisenhower's gamble, by the end of August 1944, the Allied armies were moving faster than any war planner had ever imagined. Patton's tanks thundered across France. Montgomery's men were nearing Belgium, and the German front was cracking. Yet, amid the triumph, General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a quiet crisis. His armies were devouring fuel faster than it could be delivered. He understood something most generals didn't like to admit. Battles are won by logistics, not heroism. No army, he wrote, can move without gasoline. Eisenhower's gamble was total. He gave absolute road priority to the Red Ball Express, even at the expense of other operations. Fighter-bomber missions were delayed to conserve AV maintenance was constant. Engines overheated, brakes failed, and transmissions died under strain. Mechanics worked in mud, using flashlight beams and curses as their only tools. Supply officers requisitioned spare parts from captured German depots. Fuel lines were patched with rags. Tires were retreaded by hand. Yet the system worked. It had to. By late August, the Red Ball Express was delivering an average of 2,500 tons of supplies a day, enough to keep Patton's Third Army moving at full speed. The logistical miracle kept tanks rolling, artillery firing, and aircraft fueled. Without it, the Allied advance would have died somewhere in the French countryside. But behind the success, their Asian fuel. Rail construction was postponed. Every available truck, every able-bodied driver, was thrown into the supply effort. General John C.H. Lee, the man in charge of the communications zone, became the architect of movement. Known for his strictness and bureaucracy, Lee now revealed his genius for organization. He converted entire French villages into fuel depots, commandeered local garages as repair shops, and requisitioned tens of thousands of spare tires from England. The system was ugly, improvised, and chaotic. But it worked. Patton, famously impatient, praised it in his own way. "My men can eat their belts," he said, "but my tanks have got to have gas." And for a time, the Red Ball Express ensured that they did. To the Germans, the Allied advance after Normandy was terrifying in its speed. They had expected a slow crawl through France, another trench war. Instead, they faced an army that seemed to appear everywhere at once, rolling east with endless armor and supplies. German reconnaissance pilots began reporting endless convoys, stretching from the beaches to the front. Luftwaffe attempts to bomb them achieved little. Allied air superiority made daytime attacks suicidal. At night, the convoys vanished into darkness, their headlights masked, their movement ghost-like. For German intelligence, the Red Ball route became a mystery. They intercepted radio chatter, but couldn't understand how so many supplies were moving without railroads. Their own fuel shortages made counterattacks almost impossible. Tanks were abandoned for lack of gasoline. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt later admitted, "It was not the enemy's guns that defeated us. It was his trucks." Even the Wehrmacht's famed efficiency could not match the raw industrial power and mobility of the American machine. For every German truck on the road, the Allies had 10. And for every liter of gasoline the Germans lacked, the Red Ball Express delivered another 100 gallons to the front. The German soldiers mocked American abundance, until they realized it was unstoppable. They nicknamed the convoys Gespensterstraße, the Ghost Road. Every night, they could hear the low rumble of engines somewhere beyond the hedgerows, carrying fuel and shells toward the guns that would destroy them by morning. The moral angle, the unsung heroes for the soldiers of the Red Ball Express. The war was not fought for medals or headlines. It was fought for recognition and for dignity. Most of the drivers were black soldiers who lived under segregation, even as they risked their lives for a country that denied them equality. They endured racism from fellow soldiers, were denied promotions, and ate in separate mess halls. But on the Red Ball route, their work silenced critics. Commanders who had doubted them now depended on them. Patton's tanks didn't care who drove the trucks, only that they arrived on time. The drivers became indispensable. When shortages hit, they worked double shifts. When convoys were ambushed, they defended their loads with pistols and grit. They earned respect not by protest, but by performance. In 1944, few white soldiers ever saw these drivers at work. They were ghosts behind the front lines, but their impact was everywhere. In every tank that rolled, every artillery barrage fired, every liberated town. For many, the Red Ball Express became more than a mission. It became a statement. A statement that valor comes in many forms, that courage is not limited to combat, that driving through enemy country without rest, unarmed and unseen, can be just as heroic as storming a beach. Their success planted seeds for change. General Eisenhower himself later remarked that the performance of black units in logistics and engineering would influence the eventual integration of the U.S. Army. The Red Ball Express had done more than supply an army. It had carried the moral weight of progress. The symbolic angle. Speed as salvation every. War has its icons, the Spitfire, the Sherman, the Higgins boat. But the Red Ball Express represented something quieter, the victory of persistence over chaos. Its symbol, the red circle, came to mean movement, life, and continuity. Drivers painted it on helmets, trucks, and even on the sides of barns. To French villagers, it was the mark of hope, a sign that food, medicine, and liberation were near. Each mile conquered by those convoys was a victory against paralysis, against the fear that war would grind to a halt before reaching Berlin. The Red Ball Express was not glamorous, but it was relentless. And in war, relentlessness wins. By mid-September, as autumn clouds rolled over France, the convoys still thundered east. Every day, another miracle of motion. Every night, another race against exhaustion. And soon, that miracle would reach its breaking point. As the roads grew longer, the fuel ran thin, and the battle for supply, September 1944, France. The Red Ball Express had become more than a route. It was a force of nature. From the beaches of Normandy to the fields outside Paris, the roads pulsed with motion. Thousands of trucks thundering east. A rolling lifeline that never slept. At dawn, the horizon shimmered with heat rising off the metal hoods of GMCs. At dusk, the same roads glowed faintly under the filtered blue light of blackout lamps. Every 20 minutes, another convoy launched, each carrying fuel, ammunition, and food for the advancing armies clawing toward Germany. They called it the rolling pipeline. And in truth, it was one made not of steel or valves, but of men and machines bound together by exhaustion and will. The peak of the Express. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express was moving over 1,200 tons of supplies daily, using nearly 6,000 trucks and 23,000 drivers. The operation consumed more gasoline than it delivered, yet without it, the Allied advance would have collapsed. Fuel depots at the Normandy beaches became anthills of chaos. Drums stacked 5 high, rows of trucks waiting to load. Mechanics worked through the night. MPs barked orders at intersections, keeping the endless flow of traffic from choking itself. At the front, Patton's Third Army tore through the French countryside, pushing the Germans toward the Moselle River. But for every tank that advanced, a truck somewhere behind it had to deliver its heartbeat. Each Sherman burned 3 gallons of fuel for every mile. Each artillery gun needed fresh shells every few hours. The trucks had to arrive, no matter what. The road to Chartres, the most dangerous stretch, was between Saint-Lô and Chartres. 300 miles of narrow, winding roads that twisted through destroyed villages and over bombed bridges. Drivers called it the Gauntlet. Convoys moved nose to tail, their engines droning like a single giant machine. Enemy air attacks were rare now. The Luftwaffe was broken, but the dangers were endless. Broken axles, blown tires, overturned trucks. In some places, the road edge gave way, and entire vehicles vanished into ditches. The army cleared wrecks daily, but the scars of yesterday's chaos lined every mile. Despite the exhaustion, the men pressed on. Private Eddie Carter of the 39 18th later recalled, "We didn't think about sleep. We thought about the guys waiting for that gas. If we stopped, they stopped. And if they stopped, the whole war stopped. It wasn't bravado, it was duty." Each man understood the weight of what he carried. The liberation of Paris and the strain that followed. When Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944, it was the Red Ball Express that delivered the food and medical supplies to the starving population. Trucks rolled straight through the city's boulevards, cheered by crowds waving flags and flowers. Drivers tossed chocolate bars to children from the windows. For a brief moment, amid the ruins, the sound of engines meant freedom. But beneath the celebration, the strain was showing. The trucks were wearing out. Drivers were collapsing from lack of rest. Mechanics couldn't keep up with the pace. Some convoys lost half their vehicles before reaching the front. The Express was burning itself alive to keep the war moving. Command under pressure, General Eisenhower knew it couldn't last. The Red Ball Express was a miracle, but a temporary one. The Allies still lacked a deep-water port. Cherbourg was operational only in part, and Antwerp, the great prize, remained unusable until the Scheldt estuary could be cleared. Supplies still had to come ashore through makeshift beachheads, loaded by hand onto trucks that immediately sped east. Patton's advance slowed. His tanks, once unstoppable, began to sputter from lack of fuel. The Third Army's 4th Armored Division came to a halt outside Nancy. For the first time since D-Day, momentum faltered. In late September, Schaff issued emergency orders. Prioritize fuel above all else. Ammunition, rations, and spare parts would wait. Every available truck would carry gasoline to the front. The Red Ball Express became the lifeline of a lifeline. Each truck loaded with nothing but fuel drums, their cargo volatile and exposed. Drivers joked that one bullet could turn their convoy into a rolling inferno. But no one laughed for long. Fire on the road accidents were common. A single spark could ignite dozens of trucks. One report from September 1944 described a fuel convoy near Dreux that went up in flames after a collision. The fire burned for hours, visible for miles. Drivers pulled comrades from wreckage, their uniforms melted by the heat. Still, replacements arrived, engines roaring through the smoke to fill the gap. The line could not break. To keep morale alive, officers began calling it the Red Ball Derby, a race against chaos. They issued coffee by the gallon and cigarettes by the crate. Drivers played jazz on truck radios when the static cleared. In the cab lights, faces looked ghostly. Young men aged by fatigue. The unseen front view photographers captured the Red Ball Express. Few journalists wrote about it. The glory belonged to the infantry and the armor, to the generals and victories that made headlines. Yet, quietly, this was the front line too. The battle for supply. The men who drove those convoys faced every danger except recognition. No medals, no ceremonies, only another run, another night, another mile of road that looked exactly like the last. And yet, through it all, the line held an unbroken artery of steel and courage that refused to stop. The Red Ball Express had turned France's ruined roads into the most powerful weapon of mobility the world had ever seen. But even miracles have breaking points. And as autumn deepened, the men who kept the front alive were about to face their hardest challenge yet, keeping the artery open as Europe itself began to freeze, turned into a fight for survival. Late September 1944, France to Belgium. The roads had become rivers of mud. Autumn rains fell without mercy. Tires spun helplessly, sinking into ruts that swallowed entire wheels. Convoys slowed to a crawl. The once steady rhythm of the Red Ball Express, the pounding heartbeat of engines, now faltered under the weight of exhaustion and weather. What began as a miracle of motion was now a desperate struggle against nature itself. The Allied advance had reached the very edge of supply. Patton's spearheads were stalled near Metz and Nancy. Montgomery's troops were bogged down in Holland. Eisenhower's dream of ending the war by Christmas was slipping away. Not because of German resistance, but because of the roads. The longest miles each driver felt it. Engines sputtered, axles cracked. Trucks that had run non-stop for weeks began to die where they stood. Mechanics scavenged parts from burned-out vehicles to resurrect the others. Some convoys left with 40 trucks and arrived with 12 men drove until they hallucinated, seeing phantom headlights in the rain, hearing voices over engines. A few collapsed at the wheel, their bodies pulled aside by fellow drivers who simply slid into the seat and kept going. Private Melvin Warren of the 3918th later wrote, "We didn't know if we were heroes or ghosts. We just knew we couldn't stop. Every mile mattered. Every delay meant frontline soldiers went hungry, tanks sat idle, and artillery fell silent. The Red Ball Express wasn't just delivering fuel. It was holding the line between momentum and stagnation. The limits of endurance by early October. The Red Ball Express was running at less than half its original strength. Trucks broke faster than they could be repaired. Fuel depots were empty before new shipments arrived. Drivers were down to 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night. Some went days without any. The command tried to reorganize. Convoy schedules were tightened. Units rotated in shifts, but replacements were scarce. Many of the original drivers, those who had carried the first loads from Normandy, were gone, injured, reassigned, or dead from accidents. Yet, even in exhaustion, there was pride. Each driver knew that every gallon of fuel delivered meant another German retreat, another Allied victory, another chance for the war to finally end. Weather and the road to Hell October brought mud. November brought ice. The Red Ball Express had to fight through both. In the Ardennes region, frost glazed the roads into sheets of glass. Tires slid, trucks jackknifed, and engines froze solid overnight. Still, the convoys ran. When fog descended, visibility vanished. Drivers tied ropes from one truck to the next to keep the line together. Some used the glow of the preceding truck's tailpipe as their only guide. One wrong turn meant a plunge into a ravine. Fuel drums began leaking from the cold. Ammunition boxes split from moisture. Every hour, another breakdown. And yet the order from headquarters never changed. Keep the supply lines open. The turning of the tide. Then came December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Germany's last major counteroffensive crashed through the Ardennes, splitting Allied lines and threatening to encircle entire divisions. Suddenly, every truck, every driver, every gallon of fuel mattered more than ever before. The Red Ball Express, already crippled, was thrown back into full action. Thousands of trucks raced supplies to the front under constant threat of air attack and ambush. Convoys were rerouted through alternate roads, often under artillery fire. It was chaos reborn. But this time, the drivers were veterans. They knew what to do. They pushed through. As Patton turned his Third Army north to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne, his tanks moved only because the Red Ball Express refused to die. The same men who had begun the race in August were still there. Now, battle-hardened, grim, and unbreakable. The same trucks, battered and blackened, still rolled through sleet and fire. One driver later said, "We didn't fight the Germans with guns. We fought them with gears." The moment of triumph, by January 1945, as the German offensive collapsed and the Allies resumed their march toward the Rhine, the Red Ball Express had done the impossible. Over 5 months, it had delivered 412,000 tons of supplies across France and Belgium. It had kept an army of over 2 million men moving forward. It had saved campaigns, preserved momentum, and changed the very idea of modern warfare. And yet, as the pressure eased, so did the convoy. Slowly, the Red Ball routes were closed, replaced by new logistics networks. Rail lines reopened, ports restored. The great convoys began to fade from the roads they had once ruled. The last official Red Ball Express convoy rolled in November 1944, but its spirit carried on through the winter battles that followed. When it was over, the men who had driven those endless miles were sent home quietly. No parades, no medals, no speeches, just silence, and the memory of roads that had eaten months of their lives. But the generals knew. Eisenhower knew. Patton knew. Every soldier who had eaten, fought, or lived because of those convoys knew. Without the Red Ball Express, the Allied advance would have died in the mud of France. They hadn't just supplied a war. They had sustained history itself. November 1944, Western Europe. The convoys that had once shaken the ground of France now stood still. The Red Ball Express, once the roaring artery of the Allied advance, came to a gradual stop. Its mission, to keep the front alive had been accomplished. But the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise that had filled those long, sleepless months. The great roads were empty now. Tire tracks faded under rain. Abandoned trucks rusted where they'd died. French villagers who had waved at the drivers now watched the quiet fields return to stillness. The war had moved east to the German border, where new battles loomed beyond the Rhine. The transition by late November, the Red Ball Express officially ceased operations. Its routes were replaced by more permanent systems, railway lines repaired by engineers, pipelines stretching across liberated Europe, and new convoys with broader distribution networks. The success of the Antwerp port, opened in late November 1944, finally relieved the pressure that had choked the supply system since D-Day. Ships could now unload directly into the heart of Europe. The trucks that once made the impossible runs from Normandy were reassigned, repaired, or scrapped. But even as the system changed, the lessons remained. The Red Ball Express had proven something that textbooks and strategy papers could not: that speed, coordination, and sheer human will could replace infrastructure, at least for a time. It was proof that logistics could win wars. General Eisenhower himself later admitted that without the Red Ball Express, the Allied advance in France would have stalled indefinitely. Our armies, he wrote, could not have reached the German frontier as quickly as they did without those truck drivers. They proved that supply is the ultimate weapon. The cost for the men who had lived on those roads, the end came with mixed emotions. Relief, yes, but also emptiness. They had lived by the engine's rhythm, by the smell of diesel and sweat. Now, the war seemed far away. Most of the drivers were quietly reassigned to other logistics duties, transporting supplies in Belgium, or ferrying ammunition to forward bases in Luxembourg. A few were absorbed into the new Green Diamond Express and White Ball line systems that replaced Red Ball operations along the German frontier. Some never made it home. Records show that hundreds of Red Ball Express drivers died in accidents, ambushes, or fires. Their names rarely appeared in dispatches. There were no monuments then, only memories shared in letters and barracks. Private Leroy Davis of the 3140th Truck Company wrote home, "It's funny. We drove through war but never saw it. We carried it. We kept it alive. And now it's gone, like smoke off the road." For many of the African-American soldiers, the end of the Express meant a return to the harsh reality of segregation. The same army that had depended on their courage still kept them in separate units. But among themselves, and among the officers who had commanded them, respect had been earned the hard way. Colonel Loren Ayers, who oversaw Red Ball operations, later said, "No troops did more to sustain the Allied drive across France than those men in the trucks. They drove with discipline, with courage, and with pride. They made history, even if history forgot them." The shadow of victory, the Allied push continued through winter. New convoys, more organized, better equipped, carried supplies through the Ardennes and into the heart of Germany. Yet, in every dispatch, echoes of the Red Ball Express remained. Its model of round-the-clock, one-way traffic became a template for every major logistical operation that followed. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps adopted new doctrines, manuals, and training systems based directly on its success. More importantly, it left a legacy in the hearts of the men who served. Many would later say that those long nights on the road were the hardest and proudest days of their lives. The Red Ball Express had ended, but its momentum carried forward, into history, into doctrine, and into the memory of every soldier who knew what it meant to deliver under fire. Spring 1945. Germany. The war was ending. Hitler's Reich was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins, and Allied convoys now rolled through territories that once bristled with resistance. The Red Ball Express was gone, but its spirit lived on in every mile of steel and sweat that had brought the Allies to this moment. What began as an emergency measure on the dirt roads of Normandy had become a legend, a testament to human endurance, innovation, and quiet heroism. The logistics legacy. The Red Ball Express had rewritten the rules of warfare. Before 1944, military doctrine assumed that armies could only move as far as their railheads. The campaign across France shattered that belief. The Allies proved that with organization, manpower, and mechanical resilience, a modern army could live entirely from its trucks. This revelation transformed logistics forever. When planners analyzed the Red Ball Express after the war, they realized that it had not just supported operations, it had defined them. The mobility of the Western Front was made possible by an improvised supply network that reached the limits of endurance yet never collapsed. From it came new doctrines, mobile depots, rolling maintenance units, and forward logistics bases, concepts that would shape Korea, Vietnam, and even Desert Storm decades later. Every convoy, every fuel line, every motor pool in future wars would carry a trace of the Red Ball's DNA. One post-war report by the U.S. Army Transportation Corps put it bluntly. The Red Ball Express demonstrated that logistics is the true engine of victory. It became a study in military academies, a blueprint for what happens when necessity meets improvisation and discipline meets chaos. But beyond the manuals and statistics, there was another, quieter victory. One not measured in tons or miles. The human legacy, the Red Ball Express, had also changed the face of the U.S. Army. At a time when segregation defined every aspect of military life, the operation showed what African American soldiers could do when given responsibility, trust, and purpose. They had proven themselves not just as laborers but as leaders, technicians, and warriors of logistics. Nearly three-quarters of all Red Ball drivers were black, men who, before 1944, had been relegated to menial tasks and denied combat roles. But on the roads of France, their performance was undeniable. Commanders who once doubted them came to rely on them completely. The success of these units became a turning point in attitudes within the Army. When the war ended, General Eisenhower and others cited their achievements as part of the evidence that led to the eventual desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces in 1948 under President Harry S. Truman. Though few of those drivers lived to see that change formally take effect, their work had helped lay its foundation. They had fought prejudice not with protest, but with performance, with a record that history could not ignore. Private Eddie Carter, who survived the campaign, later said, "We didn't carry medals. We carried gas and hope, and we carried them all the way to victory. For those men, the Red Ball Express was more than a mission. It was vindication." The memory in the years after the war, the Red Ball Express slipped quietly into the background of history. The world remembered Normandy, the Bulge, and Berlin, not the endless convoys that made those victories possible. But memory, like history, has a way of resurfacing. In the 1950s, a Hollywood film titled The Red Ball Express tried to tell the story, though it softened the harsh truths of segregation and fatigue. Veterans watched it with mixed emotions, proud that their work was remembered, frustrated that their reality had been simplified. The cost for the men who had lived on those roads, the end came with mixed emotions. Relief, yes, but also emptiness. They had lived by the engine's rhythm, by the smell of diesel and sweat. Now, the war seemed far away. Most of the drivers were quietly reassigned to other logistics duties, transporting supplies in Belgium, or ferrying ammunition to forward bases in Luxembourg. A few were absorbed into the new Green Diamond Express and White Ball line systems that replaced Red Ball operations along the German frontier. Some never made it home, Records show that hundreds of Red Ball Express drivers died in accidents, ambushes, or fires. Their names rarely appeared in dispatches. There were no monuments then, only memories shared in letters and barracks. Private Leroy Davis of the 3140th Truck Company wrote home, "It's funny. We drove through war, but never saw it. We carried it. We kept it alive, and now it's gone, like smoke off the road." For many of the African American soldiers, the end of the Express meant a return to the harsh reality of segregation. The same army that had depended on their courage still kept them in separate units. But among themselves, and among the officers who had commanded them, respect had been earned the hard way. Colonel Loren Ayers, who oversaw Red Ball operations, later said, "No troops did more to sustain the Allied drive across France than those men in the trucks. They drove with discipline, with courage, and with pride. They made history, even if history forgot them." The shadow of victory, the Allied push continued through winter. New convoys, more organized, better equipped, carried supplies through the Ardennes and into the heart of Germany. Yet, in every dispatch, echoes of the Red Ball Express remained. Its model of round-the-clock, one-way traffic became a template for every major logistical operation that followed. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps adopted new doctrines, manuals, and training systems based directly on its success. More importantly, it left a legacy in the hearts of the men who served. Many would later say that those long nights on the road were the hardest and proudest days of their lives. The Red Ball Express had ended, but its momentum carried forward into history, into doctrine, and into the memory of every soldier who knew what it meant to deliver under fire. Spring 1945, Germany. The war was ending. Hitler's Reich was collapsing, cities lay in ruins, and Allied convoys now rolled through territories that once bristled with resistance. The Red Ball Express was gone, but its spirit lived on in every mile of steel and sweat that had brought the Allies to this moment. What began as an emergency measure on the dirt roads of Normandy had become a legend. A testament to human endurance, innovation, and quiet heroism. The logistics legacy, the Red Ball Express, had rewritten the rules of warfare. Before 1944, military doctrine assumed that armies could only move as far as their railheads. The campaign across France shattered that belief. The Allies proved that with organization, manpower, and mechanical resilience, a modern army could live entirely from its trucks. This revelation transformed logistics forever. When planners analyzed the Red Ball Express after the war, they realized that it had not just supported operations, it had defined them. The mobility of the Western Front was made possible by an improvised supply network that reached the limits of endurance, yet never collapsed. From it came new doctrines, mobile depots, rolling maintenance units, and forward logistics bases, concepts that would shape Korea, Vietnam, and even Desert Storm decades later. Every convoy, every fuel line, every motor pool in future wars would carry a trace of the Red Ball's DNA. One post-war report by the U.S. Army Transportation Corps put it bluntly. The Red Ball Express demonstrated that logistics is the true engine of victory. It became a study in military academies, a blueprint for what happens when necessity meets improvisation, and discipline meets chaos. But beyond the manuals and statistics, there was another, quieter victory. One not measured in tons or miles. The human legacy, the Red Ball Express, had also changed the face of the U.S. Army. At a time when segregation defined every aspect of military life, the operation showed what African American soldiers could do when given responsibility, trust, and purpose. They had proven themselves not just as laborers, but as leaders, technicians, and warriors of logistics. Nearly 3/4 of all Red Ball drivers were black, men who, before 1944, had been relegated to menial tasks and denied combat roles. But on the roads of France, their performance was undeniable. Commanders who once doubted them came to rely on them completely. The success of these units became a turning point in attitudes within the army. When the war ended, General Eisenhower and others cited their achievements as part of the evidence that led to the eventual desegregation of the U.S. Armed Forces in 1948 under President Harry S. Truman. Though few of those drivers lived to see that change formally take effect. Their work had helped lay its foundation. They had fought prejudice not with protest, but with performance, with a record that history could not ignore. Private Eddie Carter, who survived the campaign, later said, "We didn't carry medals. We carried gas and hope, and we carried them all the way to victory." For those men, the Red Ball Express was more than a mission. It was vindication. The memory in the years after the war, the Red Ball Express slipped quietly into the background of history. The world remembered Normandy, the Bulge, and Berlin. Not the endless convoys that made those victories possible, but memory, like history, has a way of resurfacing. In the 1950s, a Hollywood film titled The Red Ball Express tried to tell the story, though it softened the harsh truths of segregation and fatigue. Veterans watched it with mixed emotions, proud that their work was remembered, frustrated that their reality had been simplified. In time, the truth began to emerge again through memoirs, documentaries, and oral histories. The names of the units, the 36th 40th, 39th 18th, 39th 47th, returned to the pages of remembrance. Museums and archives began to honor their service. In 1992, a memorial was erected in Saint-Lô, France, the birthplace of the Red Ball route, commemorating the men who drove through hell to keep freedom moving. It stands beside the old highway, where the echoes of engines once filled the air. To this day, military logisticians study the Red Ball Express not as a miracle, but as a masterpiece of human endurance. It remains one of the clearest lessons in all of military history, that courage is not only found in combat, but in persistence, in the relentless, thankless drive to keep others fighting. The Red Ball Express was more than a convoy. It was a covenant between men and mission, between duty and history, between the will to move and the need to win. And even after the engines went silent, its legacy never stopped moving. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The guns fell silent, and across the fields of France, the roads that once carried thunder were reclaimed by wind and grass. Somewhere, rusting in a forgotten field, an old GMC truck sat alone, its tires flat, its paint faded, the red circle on its door barely visible through dust and rain. No one would ever know how many miles it had driven, how many lives its cargo had saved, or how many nights its driver fought sleep and fear to keep it moving. But history remembers what that truck stood for. It stood for the power of movement, the relentless, unglamorous, unstoppable force that turns chaos into victory. The Red Ball Express was not built on glory or fame, but on grit and duty. It proved that logistics is not the background of war. It is the war, fought without bullets, but with the same courage and cost. And behind its wheel sat men who had been told they were less, who were denied equality, yet delivered victory. Their story is a reminder that progress often comes not through speeches, but through service. They paved not only the road to Berlin, but the road to recognition, to dignity, and to change. Today, military historians still marvel at the numbers. 412,000 tons of supplies, 6,000 trucks, 23,000 drivers. But numbers cannot capture the truth of it. The mud, the fatigue, the whispered prayers in the cab before another night's run. Those roads were not just supply lines. They were lifelines, arteries of hope, drawn across a broken continent. When the war ended, the Red Ball Express disappeared into silence. But its lesson remains eternal, that in every great struggle, victory depends not only on those who fight at the front, but on those who keep the front alive. Because sometimes, history is not written in gunfire. Sometimes, it's written in tire tracks, leading toward a dawn that others will never see, but one they helped make possible. The Red Ball Express did not just move supplies, it moved history itself.